Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, as I know that we have attendees tuning in from all over the world today. Welcome to today's webinar on the formula for building a resilient organization. Today's webinar is hosted by TalentSmart, and for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a global training and development company and the world's premier provider of emotional intelligence training, assessments, certification, and coaching. We've been in business for almost 20 years, and everything that we do at TalentSmart is all centered around emotional intelligence, or EQ. So please note that today, throughout the webinar, when you hear these two terms, emotional intelligence or EQ, just know that we're speaking about the same thing. Before I introduce our team today, who will be facilitating today's webinar, I would like to take care of a few quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar is about 30 minutes, and we do have a lot of ground to cover and a lot of content, so buckle up. We are recording today's webinar, so for anybody that hops on late or for any of you that have to hop off early, don't worry, you will receive today's recording via email about 1 hour after the webinar completes, and you'll get that to the email that you registered with, so keep an eye out for that. Additionally, there will be a survey at the end of the webinar that will populate once we close out the webinar, and we really do appreciate that feedback. It's about 5 quick questions. We want to continue creating content all around emotional intelligence to help make you and your organization successful. So any feedback that you can provide for us, we really do appreciate. Additionally, we know that you will have a lot of questions that we cover today. So please feel free to type them right into that question box right on the right-hand side of your screen on your GoToWebinar panel. You should see a section that is titled questions with a small arrow next to it. So please just keep an eye out for that. You can type your questions in at any time. We will be devoting a portion at the end of today's webinar for Q&A. And I would love to get going and introduce our team at TalentSmart. My name is Kate Barsby. I am the Director of Marketing here, and I will be in the driver's seat today as our chauffeur. And I am tuning in from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dr. Jean Greaves will be our tour guide and subject matter expert for today's webinar. Jean is the co-founder of TalentSmart and also the co-author of the best-selling book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0. You might be familiar with that book or that title. It's a #2 business book on the Wall Street Journal's bestsellers list. You can find it at any Hudson News store or Barnes & Noble or any major book retailer, and with over 2 million copies of it sold. So it's a very popular title. And also joining Jean will be Dr. Sherry Duchak, who is the Director of Training here at TalentSmart. Both Jean and Sherry will be joining us from San Diego today, so I would love to welcome both of them. As I said, I am tuning in from Philadelphia. Jean, Sherry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
I can hear you great, Kate. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. We're excited to jump into today's content on the formula for building a resilient culture and organization. So, Jean, I would love for you to take the lead, if you may, and we can go ahead and get started and share what we're going to cover for our groundwork in today's webinar.
Okay, thank you, Kate. And greetings to all of you today from both Sherry and myself. If you're listening, we believe you will benefit from lessons learned at a Texas organization in 2014. It really mirrors what the world is facing now in 2020, but back then they were facing it on their own with the whole world watching. But they did emerge with resilience, and Sherry and I both felt it important to discuss 4 things today with you. The first being the 2 important lessons identified by a business school case study review after that crisis. Secondly, we'd like to showcase insights that we all can apply at our organizations today to build resilience into our cultures. And thirdly, and to be sure it's not just a hypothetical exercise, we want to share 2 stories of organizations putting these insights into practice today. And then finally, how emotional intelligence skills factor into the actions that you can apply at your organization. So yeah, let's get started, Sherry.
All right, Jean. I'd actually like to ask our listeners a question first. We have about 500 people registered from around the world gathered here virtually on May 28th, 2020. So I actually thought it might be interesting to find out how prepared that we think our organizations were when COVID-19 began. So as you hear and see the options that Kate shares, please share how ready your organization was for recognizing the threat COVID-19 would pose.
Great, thanks so much, Sherry. And I have launched that poll for everybody, so please feel free to go in and select your response for back on March 1st. How ready did you feel that your organization was for recognizing the threat that COVID-19 would pose? Were you already taking targeted actions? Were you thinking and talking about actions but hadn't started? Maybe your organization was aware of it, but we're still operating in a business as usual. Or perhaps you hadn't yet acknowledged it quite as relevant at March 1st. So go ahead and please select your response. I do see that a lot of responses coming in, so we'll just give it another moment or two. All right, great. Thanks so much. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll, Sherry, and I would like to share the responses with our group today, that we see that 35% actually were aware of COVID-19, but we're still operating in a business as usual. And then the second largest group was thinking and talking about actions, but hadn't yet started.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you everyone for participating. I think this is really interesting, and I know Jean and I were talking about it as well. And we felt that as of March 1st, we were along with the majority of you, that we were aware of it, but still in many ways operating in business as usual. I know I had traveled and was out of state conducting training. And so it's interesting to see how everybody felt they were on March 1st, because this is the exact moment that we want to take you to for a story that we would like to share from the past. Now, we share this story not to highlight what was done perfectly or what fell short, but we think it's important to look at examples we've seen in the past and the actions taken then so that we can build a formula for resilience for the future. I'd love for you to actually share the story, Jean.
Okay, sure. Now, on September 30th, 2014, people in the US generally knew that since March of that year, there was an outbreak of a virus called Ebola, and it was spreading over there in Africa. It really did feel like it was something serious, but it was happening a world away. The very next morning, right, on October 1st, a 42-year-old man, Thomas Duncan, arrived at the Texas Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas, having contracted Ebola in Liberia before traveling to the US to visit family. He didn't feel any symptoms until 5 days after arriving in the US, and the hospital was like all of us, aware, but not on high alert to respond to something happening so far away. So this is the first time in the US the virus arrived, as you can see by the orange dot over there in Texas in the US. And after reporting that he was feeling somewhat better, they did send him home. Now, sadly, he returned to the hospital in a rapid state of decline, and his case was ultimately proved fatal. 2 nurses contracted Ebola during the treatment, and the hospital immediately mass tested everyone. The nurses recovered, and the virus was contained, and Ebola was contained across all of the US from then on. It did not spread. Now, 3 years later, in 2017, the University of Houston's Business School set out to examine the hospital's response from start to finish. And their findings provide important lessons for organizations facing any threat of a sudden change. And the actions of the medical team in the hospital were the types all people and all businesses make, especially in times of crisis. And I think we can learn a lot by taking a closer look at their lessons learned. And I say this at the start because no one was or is protected from being caught by surprise, and we wanted to show you why.
Yeah, Jean, and before we go into the why, allow me to first clarify why we should even care about this story. We are all receiving guidance right now on how to take care of ourselves and our families and what precautions will help us in the long run. And this is part of being resilient. Resilience, however, can also be applied to organizations as well. So let's take a look at the definition of resilience from the American Psychological Association. Resilience is the ability to adapt in the face of tragedy, trauma, adversity, hardship, and ongoing significant stressors. So resilience requires being on alert, making decisions quickly, and acting fast through ongoing adversity. Now, let's not forget, however, that we are emotional creatures, so emotions are going to be the ones that alert us to tragedy, trauma, and adversity. Our ability to adapt to all of this depends on how we manage our emotions in order to be effective. And this is what we call emotional intelligence. In this model of emotional intelligence, keep in mind that awareness is what you see and management is what you do. But all 4 EQ skills support resilient behavior.
Yes, and resilience is not a definition that says you or your organization prevented tragedy or adversity. That's really not the issue. The important part about understanding resilience for organizations is this. It's like, what does your organization do in response to disruption? This is the management part of EQ. What did Texas Health Presbyterian do early on during the crisis that we can learn from? They were resilient in response, not that they prevented it, but they did respond, and be aware that resilience is about bouncing back from a crisis rather than being consumed by it. So this conversation today is about how to build the conditions and a culture inside of our organizations to help make our companies resilient and more able to bounce back. So here's the first major lesson from the review of what happened at the hospital in 2014. Even though Ebola had been a significant global crisis for the 10 months already by the time September rolled around, the doctors and nurses overlooked Mr. Duncan's case as a possibility because there hadn't yet been one in the United States. A brief note from a nurse did mention his travel from Liberia, but there wasn't a sufficient red flag system to ensure that the medical team spotted the key warning words, recent travel from Liberia. It actually just said international travel. And they also didn't know that they would attend to it or that the hospital was aware to implement a hold policy for patients traveling from Ebola hotspots. So really, lesson number 1 is resilience requires attention plus awareness.
Thank you for that first lesson of attention plus awareness, Jean. And here is the takeaway for all of us. Our tendency is to move fast and rely on habits and past experiences. In short, our brains don't want to have to work too hard. In the book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, psychologist Daniel Kahneman talks about the importance of habits and how they preserve our mental energy. Mental energy is finite, so it's not possible for us to deliberate over everything. This can cause us to overlook things that are important and directly in front of us. Our autopilot, so to speak, can cause us to miss important new information. Now, this tendency leads us to our key insight. By paying more attention and being more broadly aware, people can keep autopilot from winning over significant new information. Certainly, in the example that Jean gave, it would have helped if the new information to be on alert for travel from Liberia had been clearly communicated as a red flag. So the question now becomes, what are those warning flags for your industry? And how will your organization communicate to your staff and those at the front door what they should watch and listen for? Now at TalentSmart, we're a training company. So we might hear our clients say casually that there will be a freeze on all training for a full year. Our team has to use our social awareness skills to listen better and watch for key signs like these comments so that we can manage our own choices. So those are our warning signs, or one potential one. What are the warning signs for your industry and your company? Jean, why don't you give an example of what paying attention and being more broadly aware looks like in action?
Yeah, happy to. Though most of our organizations were not attending to COVID-19 around the holidays of this year, we sure are now. So some organizations are demonstrating attention and awareness early enough, right? It didn't have to be before, but once it started happening early enough is still okay. So here's lesson 1 in action. At the outset of the pandemic, the cycling gym, Cycle Bar East Cobb, like all gyms, faced layoffs and total shutdown. But unlike other gyms, Cycle Bar looked deliberately at the responses of companies beyond gyms, and they devised a new plan. They reached out to gym members and rented their stationary bikes and equipment directly to their houses, delivering the sterilized machines by hand. And I'm not sure where they learned this on the fly. They didn't say this when they were interviewed, but perhaps they were watching restaurants set up for delivery. This is a wonderful kind of example of a response to an organizational crisis that required attending to the moment, aware more broadly of what others were doing in order to mobilize quickly toward a more resilient path forward.
Yes, Jean, and through the Cycle Bar example, you have shared the first half of the formula, which requires us to use our social awareness through heightened attention and awareness of what's around us. But I'd also like to talk about the second half, which I think is equally as important. The second lesson learned from the Ebola crisis in 2014 is that resilience requires group accountability. In this second lesson, all 4 EQ skills come into play: social competencies as well as personal competencies. In order to illustrate this, let's circle back to our story about the hospital in Dallas during the 2014 Ebola crisis. So back in Dallas at the hospital, the minute the US Ebola case was spotted and commented on by the media, the organization went on the defensive and publicly, if maybe inadvertently, blamed the nursing staff for not spotting key information and not raising the red flag. But the travel from Liberia was gathered and placed on the patient's chart, and the physician also didn't notice it and raise a red flag. So it really wasn't one person's or one profession's fault. It was the lack of a red flag system that all team members could watch for and participate in that ultimately caused the problem. Now, I think about this situation, and what I'd like to point out is that the public media attention was a kind of emotional trigger for spokespeople at the hospital. Had they used their emotional intelligence skills, and specifically in this case, self-management skills, they would not have made the situation worse by pointing the finger, and things would have moved along a little more smoothly. It actually, in this instance, took the nursing union to step in swiftly and severely to stop where all this was heading. Now, once they did, the key stakeholders immediately apologized so that everyone could get back to the problem solving at hand. Apologizing was an excellent choice and actually showed high EQ. If the stakeholders hadn't apologized and the Ebola outbreak had worsened, both the hospital and key professions would have been at odds with each other as they faced this heightening crisis. So what we can learn from this scenario is that placing blame creates an us versus them mentality within organizations' walls, and it also focuses attention unhealthily on the past rather than on how to proceed going forward.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about the insight and lesson. So a resilient culture would encourage doctors and nurses to notice and talk about errors safely, quickly, and openly, and empower supervisors to assist frontline staff to solve problems together and in the moment. They may not have been able to do this right before those first 2 mistakes, but they did in the moment right after. This requires suspending the traditional hierarchy of reporting relationships and allows direct collaboration between those who offer expertise, regardless of their title. Group accountability builds trust, communication, and respect across teams and various levels of expertise and shifts everyone's focus to the entire situation going forward. So this is a kind of emotional intelligence at the team and organizational level, and it requires healthy, strong relationships. And this case study did indicate how the Texas Presbyterian Hospital demonstrated that once they were able to sort of kick in gear. The resilient organization solves problems together and in the moment.
Yes, Jean, and we found this not only in our own organization, but I'm excited to say we found a terrific recent example of group accountability in action. Dan Price, the CEO of Gravity, a company that processes payments for small businesses, found his company in dire straits these last 3 months as their small business customers suffered. Rather than meet only with his management team, however, Price held an all-company meeting to openly share company finances and the kind of cuts necessary to survive without layoffs. Now, then he met with employees one at a time, individually, for a week straight to discuss potential solutions. As a company, they developed a private form where each employee wrote down what they would feasibly be able to sacrifice in terms of a pay cut in order to help save the entire company. And the system worked. Gravity didn't lay anyone off, and they made cuts on each employee's terms. So by emphasizing group accountability, Price ensured a unanimous company solution. Now, in our line of emotional intelligence work, we know that the secret behind Price's system included strong relationship skills with his staff. He had to build trust in order to navigate some of these very hard conversations, right, Jean?
Yes, and Sherry, I want to put this all together for everyone in one spot now. A resilient culture is one where people are paying more attention, being more broadly aware of both threats and opportunities to capitalize on, and working together across organizational lines and levels for a new kind of we can and will do this together mentality. Now, the 24 Ebola crisis in Texas led to a kind of tunnel vision and hastiness that ultimately led to misses at key moments. Today, we are in the exact similar conditions. We are all sitting in our Zoom tunnels making hasty decisions, and we don't yet know their ultimate impact. So from an emotional intelligence viewpoint, this requires more self-awareness, more self-management, more social awareness, and more relationship management skills. And you wonder why you might feel tired at the end of the day? Well, it can take a lot of mental and emotional energy, but it's well worth it. It's what our circumstances are requiring of us now. So next time you find yourself on autopilot or ready to cast blame, try stepping back instead of charging forward. Go for a walk, take a deep breath, and consider your situation more broadly, more creatively, and when you get back, reach out to your key people to tackle things together. This is really how emotional intelligence is right there with you as you face whatever big challenges are waiting for you tomorrow. That's really what we wanted to share. We kept it simple. There's a lot of complexity out there. So Kate, do we have time for a few questions that came in?
Yes, and thank you so much, Jean. All of these organizations that we shared, especially the case of the Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas, they're great examples of how organizations were able to have a resilience plan in place and learn and be able to pivot quickly to really react and get out in a positive way in the end. So we can use these all as great examples in the situation that we're all in right now in COVID-19. As I did say earlier, for any of you that do have questions, I have seen a few come in already. Please feel free, go ahead, write and type them into that question box, and we'll try to get through as many as we can for all of you. I would love to tackle a first question that has been submitted because I think it's really relevant. And Sherry, I would love to pose this one to you if I may. If our organization has never had conversations like this, where do we start? That's such a great question.
It really is, Kate. And I will say that before COVID-19, I traveled all over the country training and talking to groups of people who are working to be more aware, both of how their own reactions get in the way, but also how they may reach across department lines and work cross-functionally. And based on what I've witnessed, I would say that simply starting the conversation with key groups of people does a world of good. I mean, you can even consider getting together over Zoom and sharing the stories from this webinar as examples, but then asking each other how ready you are to tackle a surprise that might place your team in jeopardy. Think about what those potential changes or surprises would be, and are you prepared? If not, what are some solutions? Just get the dialogue rolling. The conversation is key.
Great. Thanks so much, Sherry. Another question that has been submitted, as I shared, please go ahead. Any questions that you have, go ahead and type them right into that question box, and we will try to answer it for you. Next question, Jean, I'd love to pose this one to you. You mentioned that the 3 parts of this resilience formula are attention, awareness, and group accountability. So that formula that we all see on the screen in front of us. Can you give me an example for each that I can do and apply today at my organization?
Okay, sure. If you're familiar with our book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, there are a few strategies that are worth mentioning that you can start practicing right away. For both attention and awareness, I would recommend the ones that are suggesting things like practicing the art of listening, or catching the mood of the room, stepping into another's shoes, right? These are the kinds of things that you can ask questions, you can notice what's unusual around you that catches your eye. For a group accountability, the kind of strategies that we would put in place are things like align your intention with your impact, or tackling a tough conversation. We felt that the Texas Presbyterian Hospital did a great job in the press with their apology. That had to have been a very tough moment. They rose to the occasion in the immediate moment, and we were really proud of that response that they had. These are simply the names of the strategies, but if you're wondering, well, what do you mean exactly what I would do? Each of the strategies has about a page and a half or 2 pages that describe actionable suggestions for how to approach it if it's something new or different. Yeah, that's what I would suggest to get started. Just a couple ideas.
Great. Thanks so much, Jean. For all of you who aren't familiar with our book, you see it right on screen in front of you. I just wanted to share that with you so you could see what that looks like and what Jean was referring to. There are 66 strategies in that book. And we actually do have a follow-up question regarding that Emotional Intelligence 2.0, and that is, we use the Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book with our managers in a leadership program and have been planning to implement the same with our entire organization. So everyone is truly speaking the same EQ language. However, until we get to that, are there some simple things that we can do with all of our staff right now to help permeate these EQ messages throughout our organization? Great question.
Let me comment on a couple of things, and Sherry, then I'll ask if anything occurs to you too. But I think one of the most powerful methods that's available to every supervisor, manager, and leader is to share their own experiences of times where they have perhaps caught themselves missing something, and then what they did in response. This idea of modeling being human, where you're not trying to be perfect in a situation where it's not realistic to be perfect, that can be contagious. So anytime you're having meetings with a collective group, being honest about what you've learned from the past week or two and how you're applying that going forward, that has a really broad effect, and it primes everyone's minds for putting that into practice going forward. So I would say mobilize this contagion of being able to kind of learn by example. How about you, Sherry? Anything occur to you that could be helpful there right in the moment?
I would absolutely agree with that, Jean. And one thing I will share from being in and out of organizations so much is modeling the human side, but also starting to model those behaviors that you're learning. It doesn't matter if the whole organization doesn't share the language yet, if they start to see shifts and changes in behaviors. And quickly, anecdotally, I can share that I had one person, a leader in a program, and then I went back to the same organization about a month later, and I had some of the people who reported to this leader come in just to meet me. And what they said was, "What did you do to him?" Well, of course, I didn't do anything. He just started changing behaviors, and they were delighted. So I think modeling the humanity, but also starting to model the behaviors that you've learned is going to be so powerful.
Great. Thank you so much, both. I have a really good question that was just submitted. I've seen people trying to be hyper aware, which comes off as reactionary paranoia, everything that smells different from how things were done before at our organization. So how do we balance this healthy awareness action with an unhealthy paranoia reaction?
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
Sherry,
want
you
to
want,
jump in?
yeah, no, you can go take it first. I'll follow. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, from my experience watching, it really ties back into what Jean just said about being very candid and open about the humanity of it, because it's not artificial shifts. It's, hey, I'm working on this. And here's where I slip, and here's what I'm working on. And then it doesn't come across as insincere. It comes across as someone who's actually trying to make a positive change. So I think the candor of the humanity is key. But Jean, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I was going to mention you know, when each new worry becomes a heightened fear, it starts to actually have everyone around you tune out. This is what the hyper-aware paranoia does, where if everything is the next crisis and each one doesn't follow through to be one, then people tune it out, and that puts the team at risk even more. So here's the beauty of working among groups and not working in isolation, is at the team level, not everyone has to be able to use these high EQ skills every moment of the time. Within a team, if someone is moving into the realm of paranoia, another team member can step forward with some facts. And so across the team, you're able to really sort of calm yourselves with information. So for example, if we just hypothetically placed ourselves back in 2014 in the hospital, if the staff's fear had come to the point where they were worried about every country that any person entering the ER had, that would be an example of now it's paranoia for anywhere outside of the US. So the more that a supervisor or someone on the team can say, no, here's the list of the countries that have been documented that would be the ones that should grab our attention, it can help focus the mind back on the, okay, yes, this is defined as the ones that should alert us and the others should not. So it's a combination of relying on your team members to balance you out. And then if you're really still left to your own devices, it still would probably be a good idea to take that walk and listen to the nature of the self-talk going on in your mind. If you're noticing that you're using words like patients always bring this in, or the next announcement that's going to come from my company is going to be bad news, that's beginning to generalize across all information coming your way, and you may be able to head it off the pass and sort of tell yourself, I really have to stop using these words always, right? Or everything is going to be bad. It's like, well, this last announcement might have been hard to hear, but the next one might not. Those are really the best options that you have access to in the moment. So I would, yeah, tune your ear to the kind of dialogue that's going on inside your head.
That's such a good point, Jean, to really have an awareness of, using those types of extreme self-talk of, very ultimate type of terms like always or never, or we never get this right. Avoiding those type of extreme terms can really help with that checks and balances process that you spoke of at the team level of EQ.
Yeah.
Great. And we do have one last question. I know we're a little over the 30-minute mark, but this is a great question, so I would love to answer it if we may. And Jean, I would love to pose this to you if I may. Would you say that emotional intelligence skills are a kind of prevention for failing during a crisis?
Okay, so I would not use the word prevention. I consider emotional intelligence skills to be a kind of emergency preparedness plan or resilience kit. If you are attending to your emotions or managing them productively, and I guess by this I would mean knowing when to speak up or keep quiet, because it would be different for different people. If you're attending to the people around you and investing in the relationships that you have with them, you are so much better prepared to respond when the tough moments surface. So just think of emotional intelligence as really being sort of a safety kit or a survival kit that you have with you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, both of you. We are a little over the 30-minute mark, and unfortunately, I know that some of you had submitted questions, and we don't have enough time to answer all of those, but as I did mention, we will compile all of them, and somebody from TalentSmart will follow up with you. Additionally, if you're interested in receiving complimentary literature specifically about EQ and resilience, we do have 2 articles that speak to additional strategies that you and your organization can apply today, and we're more than happy to provide those to you. So feel free to just make a note that you're interested in receiving them in that follow-up survey that you'll get right at the end of this webinar, and we'll be more than happy to email those out to you. We hope that you found today's content really insightful and helpful. I know this is something that's resonating with all of us right now, both on the organizational level as well as even the personal level at home. So we wish you and your organization all the best in being resilient and steadfast right now throughout the effects of the coronavirus. And Jean and Sherry, are there any closing thoughts that you would like to share with our attendees on today's webinar before we close out?
Yes, this is Jean. I do want to mention how appreciative we were to be able to review the lessons that came from the Ebola incident. It broadened our own views on how best to mobilize our team, and we're happy to make the connections between emotional intelligence skills and these kinds of circumstances. We do find that committing to practicing EQ and increasing EQ behaviors does make a difference when it matters most. And I just personally wish everyone well as you all consider how these lessons will help your people mobilize in response to whatever challenges are facing you. So my best to all of you.
And Jean and Kate, I'd just add that, I've been in regular contact with clients across all industries since the pandemic response heightened. And it's been interesting because they've shared their experiences and concerns with me. And I've even heard a few very candid comments or two about their self-management or their self-talk or even their social awareness slipping. And these conversations have shown me that we all need our EQ skills now more than ever. I mean, not only to cope with the unforeseen surprises, but to make sure we remain proactive and effective and resilient. So given this heightened need for EQ, it's been an absolute pleasure to share with everybody today. So thanks so much.
And thank you both. Thank you all our attendees on today's webinar. We do appreciate you spending this time with us, and we hope you found this to be really good and useful information that you can put to practice at your organization. As I said, that survey will pop up in a minute or two, so keep an eye out for that. And we really do appreciate that feedback. And also in about 1 hour, you should receive the recording of today's webinar via email. So feel free to forward that along to any of your colleagues at your organization. We can all definitely, I think, get some insight in terms of how to be resilient during a time right now when it's especially hard for all of us. So again, thank you all. Stay steadfast, and we hope you have a great remainder of your morning, your afternoon, or your evening. Everyone take care.